Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Fortnite using the brand new RX 9060 XT. We have the 16 gigabyte model today, and it is the XFX Swift OC version of the card. At the time of my purchase, it was a MSRP model, though we'll see how that holds true. We're playing on the latest AMD drivers, and in fact, we're actually playing on the technical preview drivers that I just currently have installed. Actually doesn't have any sort of support for Fortnite anyway, so it shouldn't really make much of a difference. And we're pairing with the 9800X 3D as well as 64 gigabytes of DDR5. Majorly overkill. However, I just want to see what the card can do in optimal conditions. Let's hop in. All right, we're starting off here at 1080p using the performance rendering mode, which puts us on DirectX 11. Unlimited frame rate for now, just to kind of see what we're going to get. And epic view distance and textures here. Now here starting out, you can see that we're stuttering pretty majorly, so we'll definitely give this some time to cook and get to a more playable state. But as you can see, and this will probably be the case even once we load in, this is largely, when you're cranking settings down this low, this is largely more of a CPU benchmark. So we'll just kind of see where the card can get us, again, under optimal conditions, pairing with a very, very strong and kind of a weird pairing with the 9800X 3D, to be completely honest, but just to kind of get a sense of what exactly the card is capable of. And we'll see what FPS we can get, and then find a place where we can actually lock the FPS and get a more consistent and stable place to be at. But as far as for now, starting off, jumping around between 300 and 200, at times even up into the 400, depending on what exactly we're doing here. And we'll go ahead and start counting here just to kind of get a sense. Now, what I've experienced on this performance mode and other tests is that our 1% lows are pretty bad, and there is some pretty significant stuttering going on. And that seems to be the case again here. That can be addressed, and we will test it out by enabling a frame rate limit. There are frame rate limits within the game that we can actually go in and apply ourselves, but there's also, the option to apply it outside the game. So it gives us a bit more control doing it outside the game with something like Riva Tuner Statistics or other software. AMD and NVIDIA both, of course, have software, but you can see 1% low down in 29. But as far as our FPS here, we are actually pretty close to being GPU bound, surprisingly. Maybe not super surprising, but we are actually in a place where we are somewhat GPU bound, so it doesn't seem to be a major problem that we have a 9800X 3D. Or not a problem, but it seems to be somewhat, acceptable for this particular test. But of course, getting 500 FPS certainly is nice in some ways, but in other ways, it's just kind of pointless, because the actual experience of playing when you're getting, these stutters and 1% lows all the way down in the 30s, definitely not a great experience. But right around 500 FPS without any sort of cap applied. So let's go ahead and apply a cap and see where that brings us up to. So just tabbing out here, and we're just going to set a 360 frame rate limit here in Riva Tuner Statistics, just to see if that kind of smooths out our performance a little bit. And we'll go ahead and begin counting, and now we are expecting to get a pretty consistent, some slight stutters will continue playing a bit, but as you can see, our 1% lows are not dropping really anywhere near where we were, maybe like slightly just for a moment, but the actual gameplay is much, much smoother. So, if you're playing on performance, I have found that it's pretty much required, unless you have just an absolute terrible GPU. If you're playing on performance mode, you're getting like 60 FPS as is. Obviously it's not necessary to set that limit, but if you have a somewhat decent GPU, it is necessary in order to get a somewhat smooth experience. But most, not all, but definitely a lot of 1080p monitors have, maybe even the higher refresh rate ones have right around 360 or so, and you certainly can populate that, so long as you have a CPU that can actually give you that kind of performance. So definitely is not going to hold you back in that regard. All right, next up here, sticking with 1080p, we're on DirectX 12 now, and using the low preset with TSR set to medium at native resolution. So this is just if you want to play native and you want to play on low settings, you want to play DirectX 12, but you want high FPS. All right, jumping in here on DirectX 12, this is low settings. So, it's funny because compared to performance mode, low settings, it looks better in some ways, just like the actual rendering process has a more pleasant and like modern look to it with the way lighting interacts. But some things do look worse. For example, on performance settings, we were on max textures, for example. So the textures themselves looked good. They look considerably worse here, as well as the view distance when compared there. But the actual general look of the game, in my opinion, does actually look quite a bit better here. We are still getting a very high FPS, and as you can see, even without any sort of cap in place, we are getting pretty respectable 1% lows. Our frame time graph is in a much more stable place. But the textures are kind of ugly. So this is still somewhat, competitive type settings. These kind of ugly textures, well, in my opinion, they don't really look great and I wouldn't prefer to have them. Some people do like to have lower, detail in a game, especially a competitive title like this. Definitely arguments to be made that it kind of improves, your ability to kind of make out enemies and things like that. But we are pretty much hovering right around that same FPS that we're getting with our performance mode with a capped FPS. So right around 300, not necessarily 360, it looks like 320 on our average here, but definitely at times like right now and 380 climbing, So very, very similar experience. I mean, to my eye, I can't really tell a major difference between, something like 330 and 360. I mean, that's just me, but maybe some people can, but I certainly am not able to make that differentiation. But, it's probably just comes down to preference. Do you like the look of DirectX 12? Do you want to play with a bit better looking details? And we could certainly increase textures independently of the rest of our settings and get a more pleasant looking image without really hurting our performance in a, major way. But definitely, low settings doesn't look great. Looks very, very similar to performance as far as the actual look of the game. It's just kind of a different way to achieve similar type FPS. All right, next setting here is Epic settings with ray tracing turned off. So I turned up all the settings to Epic here, just went and manually turned down our global illumination and reflections to come off those Lumen settings. So these are max settings, just no ray tracing quite yet. And we're playing at same thing, native TSR Native. Definitely here on Epic settings, even without the ray tracing, the game still looks incredibly good in my opinion. Definitely a major step up from low settings. Also here at Epic settings, the only thing that really doesn't look super strong is water effects. These will look notably better. We'll come back to a water area when we turn on the ray tracing, but these will look notably better when we do enable that ray tracing. But, as we bump up settings, you'll notice our 1% lows are getting better and better. So definitely a better place here. Really the best that we've seen aside from just that capped performance mode, which obviously, has its own drawbacks, but definitely really strong performance here. Not really super taxing on our GPU, of course, just using 6 gigabytes of our video memory. It is being fully utilized, our GPU, that is, but not necessarily any sort of issues. Card is running super cool. Game looks good. In my opinion, for someone like me, I'm not super competitive in Fortnite or anything like that. And, 160 FPS, this feels like incredibly strong in my opinion. And definitely feels like a smoother experience than certainly performance mode uncapped. And you are getting a really good looking picture here. Really nice looking graphics. I mean, Fortnite, well, we did just get a really major stutter there for a moment, but Fortnite does look good. It's a good looking game in general, especially when you start bumping up some settings. And I think for most casual players, if you're not playing the game super competitively, you probably want a good looking picture. That's probably more important than, getting an extra, moving up from 150 to 300. It's probably more where you'd kind of prioritize putting those resources. But certainly here at Epic settings, a really, really strong experience. And again, this is at native resolution with really strong anti-aliasing. Definitely at 1080p, you want a good anti-aliasing solution just because you don't have as many, pixels natively to kind of resolve those aliasing issues. So it is definitely nice that we are able to get, pretty much perfect performance here. Really no issue whatsoever. And last setting we'll test here at 1080p is just completely maxed out everything. So this is at native resolution, still using TSR medium for our anti-aliasing solution, and we are using absolutely everything. We'll go ahead and bump on our virtual shadows. Actually, I'm not sure if that was on before, but hardware ray tracing, Lumen Epic, everything set to Epic here. All right, coming down with our completely maxed out settings, and we are certainly noticing a pretty substantial performance hit, especially coming around the water here. So this is that same area. You can see the water does look significantly better, I will say. Now, for a game like Fortnite, you're better off having nearly double the FPS, at the cost of some pretty reflections, in my opinion. But, certainly this is not bad performance by any means. So you are still able to get, pretty solid performance here at max settings. And keep in mind, we are playing at native still here, getting right around 75, and we are near water, which I imagine will be, obviously a bit more demanding given that we are rendering in all those ray trace reflections. So let's keep moving. We'll kind of move away from the water, do some like more, normal gameplay, run into some action here and see if our FPS climbs. Just keep a kind of mark of it around 75 to begin with here. After a few minutes of gameplay here, looks like that is pretty much right. We did climb a little bit, getting away from the water, but as you can see, our FPS is kind of hovering around the 60 to 70 range. FPS average of 78. Definitely a playable experience here. In Fortnite, me personally, I would prefer to get, into that like high refresh rate range, that 150 type range. I can notice the difference certainly between 70 and 150. And really those ray trace reflections, all those ray trace effects, as we hit some major stutters there, they're taking a huge toll on our performance while not really offering us much in the terms of actual visual benefit. It does look nice when you come across water, but when you're just in the moment playing the game, you're not really going to be looking at, how nice the water looks unless you're, just really taking the sights, which is definitely a good way to get yourself killed in a game like Fortnite. But definitely a solid experience here. Not necessarily one I would personally choose to go for, but if you're a type of person who doesn't really mind, getting, sub 60, or not sub 60, but, sub like 120 FPS, we're encountering quite a bit of stutters here, surprisingly, which is a bit strange. You can see also our video memory is into that 9GB territory, so we have a 16GB variant of the card of the 9060 XT, so definitely happy to have that at this point so that we know for sure our VRAM isn't the limitation. But yeah, definitely good looking picture, but not necessarily what I would choose to go for in this particular instance. Now, this is normally where I would say, like, let's go for some upscaling. Now, the upscaling options that we have, unfortunately, there is DLSS, there is XeSS, but there is no FSR of any kind. So obviously, also means that there's not going to be any sort of, FSR 4 by any means. So we're just going to go for TSR, which is Epic's own upscaling, and we'll go for quality, which sets our 3D resolution scale to 66. Now, using this sort of setting, while it does offer an FPS boost, as you can see immediately, we're above 100, it doesn't look quite as good as FSR 4, like trees, things like that, off in the distance, more fine details, definitely have a bit of a blurry look to them, but you are now getting, that high refresh rate type experience above 100 FPS here, and still getting a pretty solid picture here at 1080p. Not as good and definitely not as sharp as you were getting natively, but if you wanted to play here at max settings and it didn't bother you to have a bit less clear of an image, maybe of a smaller monitor, 22-inch 1080p monitor, something like that, you definitely could play at these settings. And this is a solid way to play. I wish it had FSR, and I definitely wish it had FSR 4. We do have an optiscaler that you could potentially use. However, of course, there are concerns with using things like optiscaler in a multiplayer title that could potentially result in bans. But definitely a pretty solid experience here. 100 FPS, not necessarily what I would go for, but definitely a pass as far as 1080p goes here. No major issues. Just stay away from ray tracing unless you're okay with around 60 FPS at native without the use of upscaling. And then just keep in mind, on AMD cards, unfortunately, there just isn't really super great anti-aliasing solutions. I don't really know for sure what Epic's, stance is or their history is with bans when it comes to implementing things like optiscaler. Me personally, I've had the same Fortnite account for, like 8 years now or something like that. So I wouldn't personally risk, potentially losing my account over just, getting, implementing that sort of upscaling. But teach their own, and maybe they don't actually implement those bans. But definitely, you have options here, and I would probably stick with, if I wanted max FPS and I had a high refresh rate monitor here at 1080p, I'd probably just go for low settings, maybe bump up the textures independently. And if I was playing myself, like I said, I'm a more casual player, so I'd probably just go for those epic settings. But, hold the ray tracing off. I don't think that the ray tracing is really worth the squeeze to go from 150 down to like 70 range, in my personal opinion. And now moving up to 1440p, which is much more resolution. 1080p and 1440p, I could definitely see people using a 9060 XT, but 1440p is really the sweet spot. It definitely looks way better than 1080p, and the card should be capable of 1440p. So we're playing here, starting off with the performance mode. This is that DirectX 11 mode. Same settings as before. We're at native resolution, 100% 3D resolution scale, epic view distance, and epic textures. All right, loading in here on our performance settings, and it seems as though we are encountering that same sort of issue. So although our FPS is very high and our frame time graph most of the time looks flat, there are just enough spikes in there to make it a pretty choppy experience. So you could play for, 5-6 seconds even in some gameplay, maybe even, get an elimination or two without any sort of major issues. But especially at performance settings, there are enough of those little spikes, and they are pretty noticeable, especially considering the fact that we are at such a high FPS when it does, kind of come to a halt. It is pretty noticeable that I would probably avoid playing here. Now, on paper, you can see getting, 500 FPS here, definitely a impressive FPS. However, we're definitely going to want to implement some sort of frame rate cap. So we're just going to do that same thing and implement a 360 FPS frame rate cap. And we'll see if this does improve our experience at all, as far as, most notably our 1% lows. It does seem like our 1% lows are still not super strong here. We may need to lower the cap slightly. I think 360 was probably a bit too ambitious. We are touching 360 at times, but it does seem pretty close to where we're at. May need to lower this just a tad bit more. We are getting pretty, respectable 1% lows though. Most of the time sitting, or we were around 120, now dipping into the 30s with some effects going on. So I actually think 360, while this was an okay place to kind of set our FPS at 1080p, does not look like this is going to be achievable at 1440p on this particular combination. So let's actually bump it down a bit more, let's say at 240, which is still obviously a very high FPS, just not necessarily quite as high. So we'll go ahead and begin counting here. Our card should be able to hit 240 FPS here. Really, the goal is to hit it consistently enough that it removes those major stutters and gets rid of those pretty terrible 1% lows. So we'll give it a second to kind of load in here. You can see our 1% lows to begin with are not super great, but we'll give it a second here and see if it improves. And running around here, you can see 240 does seem to be pretty much a sweet spot. My opinion, this is a very competitive FPS. I mean, 240 at 1440p is a very, very good place to be at. And we are getting a silky smooth experience. Panning the camera back and forth, still getting, really solid experience here. Go ahead and call in crypto here to see if some effects make any sort of major difference. Not really. Seems to be holding very, very strong, right around 240. So performance settings, the game does look better here at 1440p. Definitely the improved resolution does help get a more, better looking image. However, of course, at performance settings, there are just those, normal issues. Like even at our max texture quality here, you can see some of these textures just look kind of ugly, as well as just generally how the game is rendering things is not super pleasant to look at. But of course, playing on performance settings, you probably don't care about that. You really just want the highest possible FPS, and we certainly are getting a very high FPS and a very high and very consistent FPS with pretty much a locked 240 FPS experience here. All right, and now moving off of DirectX 11 on DirectX 12, low settings here at 1440p, still at native using TSR medium for our anti-aliasing. So this is just the low preset. Everything set to low, a lot of stuff turned off, global illumination off, as well as reflection. So just the lowest possible settings, but we are now on DirectX 12. And very similar to what we saw, obviously, at 1080p, while DirectX 12 does generally look better, there are some things that look a bit worse. The text resolution definitely takes a bit of a hit, it seems here. Things do look pretty blocky and dull, but the general, effects, even with a lot of it turned off here at low settings, generally it's still a better looking image here. So we'll go ahead and begin counting. What I'm interested to see here is just how taxing this is for the card, and notably the 1% lows. Really, once you come off that DirectX 11 setting, the 1% lows do get pretty dramatically improved. So here sitting, right, dropping in here even in pretty intensive thing that you could do, obviously loading into the game. Still holding really solid. Frame time graph is essentially completely flat here. 1% lows all the way up in the 160s with our FPS average at around 200 or so, 210. So definitely a really strong performer here. And honestly, the game still looks pretty good. I mean, low settings are low settings. It's definitely not the best looking that Fortnite can look, but definitely looks better. Actually, I will say, I think at 1080p, I don't know what it is about the low settings at 1080p, just didn't quite look as good for whatever reason, which is strange because they're the same graphic settings, but definitely looks pretty solid here. I mean, you know, there are obviously things like I mentioned already, the texture resolution. It's a bit inconsistent. Not only is it low, like you'll see, like, you know, it doesn't really match. Like, for example, this graffiti is very dull until you get really close to it. Still not super great, but then looking at like some of the features, the signage, stuff like that, the garbage bag here, just doesn't kind of match. Like, some of those things look better than others. So, but, you know, obviously we are getting really solid performance here. And certainly if you're playing on low settings, you are expecting good performance. You're probably aiming for a competitive, like, you know, experience. And, excuse me, we are getting that without the need of really any sort of frame limiter. We're essentially getting the same performance as we limited our FPS to. So remember, we're at 240 FPS on those competitive settings, and now we're essentially right in the same kind of spot there. Dance floor here. Okay, that's cool. But definitely, you know, still a really solid performance here. I'd probably personally rather play on DirectX 12 just because I think the game looks better. And, you know, you don't really have to mess with any sort of, you know, locking your FPS to kind of get a consistent experience here. So, yeah, definitely a pass here. Even at 1440p, it doesn't really seem to change our equation too much. Still looks strong. 1% lows are really solid. Let's see if we can get into a bit of combat just to make sure that our FPS is still pretty solid. As I see some footsteps here. Let's see if we can take care of this guy. Oh, here he is. Come here, come here. People love to build in this game. But yeah, as you can see, you know, no dip whatsoever. Seems like a really solid experience here. Low settings, no problem whatsoever. Looks good, feels good, good FPS, total pass here. And now bumping up to epic settings again, just with ray tracing off for now. So just turning off the nanite virtualized geometry, leaving our global illumination and reflections at ambient occlusion and screen space reflection. So epic settings, just no ray tracing. And we're still here at native resolution using TSR medium. Now loading in here, and again, this is without ray tracing. We are getting pretty close to being under 60 FPS, even without the ray tracing. So that definitely tells me that ray tracing 1440p at epic settings is going to be off the table, at least in native resolution. But if you just wanted, you know, a real solid looking game here, native resolution, if you're okay, 60 FPS, which I know for a lot of people, 60 FPS is totally fine. You know, especially if you're just playing the game casually, you know, you're used to console, or if you're just not someone who really is super aggro about, you know, getting the most possible performance at all times, and you want to see the game, you want to see the game look good, you can certainly play this way, and is a consistent 60 plus experience here, averaging out right around 95 to begin with. Even without the ray tracing too, at epic settings here, the game does look really great in my opinion. You know, definitely amps it up a little bit when you do turn on the ray tracing, but there's not a ton to complain about here. Epic settings without the ray tracing, still a really strong looking game here. And unfortunately, it didn't help me win that fight there, but right around 96 on our average here. Definitely respectable. Not a huge benchmark there. I don't really want to load up. I think we saw what we need to saw, what we need to see, but definitely, you know, pretty respectable FPS right around 96. Good enough if you want to play at native here, but definitely, you know, I would recommend at times probably stopping there. I don't think I would introduce the ray tracing, but, you know, because we're here, let's just do it. Let's just go for our full epic preset here. This turns on all of our Lumen epic settings. We'll go ahead and toggle hardware ray tracing as well. So these are completely maxed out settings. Again, we're sticking with native here. I just want to see what native looks like. I'm not expecting this to be a 60 FPS experience, unfortunately, but I am curious exactly what kind of performance we're going to get here. And starting off here in dropping down into our zone, you can see we're actually closer, to be honest, than I thought we would be to 60 FPS, like right on the cusp of 60 FPS. So, you know, this is also not necessarily super demanding, and there will be more demanding scenes. Now you can see we're dropping to the 40s, you know, definitely around like some water like this. I can imagine it will probably drop maybe even lower, but you know, it's okay. Performance, a good starting point for sure. And although at 1080p, I am not super interested in upscaling aside from just quality, especially given the fact that we don't have FSR4 available. At 1440p is a slightly different story. You know, upscaling at 1440p definitely results in a better looking image. You know, certainly than 1080p. I'd even be probably happy going down to like a balance type preset here, but as you can see, we'll go ahead and jump into some water here to see how intensive these kind of effects are. Seems like right around the 50s. We can get it to hit 40s at times, but definitely not a super ideal experience here. You can see like with this, the sun like reflecting off the water here, getting right around the 40s. So looks really great, looks pretty. I mean, if you just want to hop in here, there's like a Fortnite event, you just want to kind of jump in, max settings, enjoy the game, 1440p. You certainly can do that at native settings here. Just not really, you know, anything below 60 in Fortnite, I'd consider that to be unplayable. In my opinion, I don't think anyone would really want to be stuck playing at sub 60 FPS. You know, even older consoles can play the game at 60 FPS. So while it does look good, in my opinion, definitely not necessarily worth the performance hit that we are taking. So let's go ahead and hop in. We'll keep it on TSR medium, and let's just bump down to quality, which gives us 66% resolution scale. And quality here does seem to shoot us beyond that 60 FPS range, getting in the 90s now. And while I certainly can tell it doesn't look quite as sharp, quite as crisp as native, certainly looks a lot better than our quality upscaling did at 1080p. Definitely as far as a, you know, solution goes that's just built into the game. I do like TSR a lot. Definitely looks better than most dynamic resolutions that are built into different titles. But yeah, definitely getting a real solid performance here. I mean, if you want to play at max settings, you're okay with 60 FPS. Slightly more, you know, getting 84 on our average, but essentially 60 FPS experience here. Our little frog buddy here is just chucking heals at us. That's actually pretty nice. You can certainly play at this, you know, on these settings and get a pretty solid experience here. Now, I am curious to see just if we mess with that TSR a little bit more, how high we can get it before we get into like a really kind of terrible looking image. So let's come down and let's adjust our resolution all the way down to performance, which actually doesn't really change it all that much. You can see the resolution scale goes from 66 to 58. Performance is only at 50. Now we can, of course, you know, adjust this on our own. Let's see, the lowest we can set it looks like 50 is actually the lowest we can set it anyways, even though this bar, I guess it makes sense, it's a full bar, but 50 does seem to be the lowest. So this is now at our performance preset at max settings. And honestly, at performance, we are getting certainly higher FPS, but obviously due to the fact that, you know, it's not that much different as far as our 3D resolution scale. It's not super wildly different. While we were getting like in the 90s, now we're getting pretty solidly above 100 at really not that much cost of any sort of image quality. I mean, we're rendering from a relatively high resolution as is, going to 1440p. There is some weirdness in motion that I am certainly noticing, but you know, max settings here, this is like borderline competitive type FPS, but TSR is kind of showing some of its limitations. If you look at our characters, like her right leg, for example, looks okay generally, but when we start moving around, you can kind of see some weirdness where like the kind of pink is trailing off there. So there is definitely a little bit of weirdness going on with the image, but if you're just playing the game competitively, you know, you probably want to be at ray tracing epic settings anyways. But if you were just wanting the best possible looking visuals and wanted a competitive high refresh rate, you certainly could do that here. And really those weird little effects, man, I wish we had FSR4 in this game, but those weird little effects are really not going to like meaningfully wreck your experience here. So definitely some options to play with. You can play here at 1440p at max settings. You can even do so native. You're just not really going to be getting a super great experience. You are going to need a bit of upscaling to get a more pleasant and, in my opinion, a more, you know, realistic kind of frame rate. Last resolution we're going to be testing here is 4K, and again, back on DirectX 11 performance mode. Kind of a weird pairing here, in my opinion. I don't know how many people would really be playing Fortnite at 4K. But if you had a 4K monitor, but you just wanted to say, give me the most possible FPS, let's see what you would get. Now, at 4K settings, playing on performance mode, like I said, it's a bit of a weird combination because you're getting this kind of ugly looking image. I don't know, performance mode, some people definitely like it. I actually think some people even prefer the visual look of how performance mode looks, less visual clutter. But it's kind of strange getting this super high resolution picture, but getting, such a low quality, image as far as our graphics go. It's kind of a strange combination in my opinion, but to each their own. I know that people do play on these settings, so I definitely want to test it out. And as you can see, our VRAM, it's funny playing at 4K, just how low our video memory is, just sitting right around 3.5 gigabytes of video memory. Definitely, nowhere near the 16 gigabytes that we do have on this GPU. Really not being used at all here. 1% lows, again, they are dipping. Performance mode and DirectX 11 in general just seems to actually really enjoy having a bit more direction when it comes to our FPS. So just kind of keeping an eye on our FPS. Looks like we're averaging out right around 230 or so. So we kind of want to set our average, or our I should say our FPS log somewhere in that territory, probably around 200 or so, to get a more consistent experience. But hey, if you just wanted max FPS here at 4K, you can get up to 200 FPS. At times even 300 or so. Definitely a pretty strong experience here. Just the visuals, performance mode, 4K. Kind of a weird combination again, but, is what it is. And certainly a pretty solid experience here. 1% lows are actually not performing that bad now that we have bumped up to 4K. There are still some spikes here and there, but 120 on our 1% low is not too terrible. You can see our 1% or our FPS average sitting around 240 or so. I think I will set our FPS log for 200 just to see if we can get a real consistent, 1% low, real consistent, smooth experience here. If I can survive encounter here. Okay, thank God. I don't know what it is. These guys I've been playing are either terrible at the game or absolute sweats at the game, but was able to get that elimination. So right around, I think I want to set our FPS right around 200 or so. And for this one, they actually do have 200 FPS inside the game, so we actually don't even need to leave the game to enable that. So setting at 200 here, and you can see we are getting a considerable, improvement in our 1% lows. Not quite a super consistent 200 FPS, at times dipping, but our 1% lows being so close to our FPS average is certainly making for a very, very smooth experience. There are still stutters, Unreal Engine, especially Unreal Engine 5, just happens to have stutters, but 180 average with 130 1% low is a incredibly strong experience here. So if you want to play at 4K, as long as you have a CPU that can push this type of resolution, which these higher resolution tests here, they shouldn't really be super reliant on our CPU in this sort of situation. This is much more reliant on our GPU. It seems to be a really, really strong experience. You can see in an indoor area, we're pretty much locked tight right at 200 FPS. Definitely very, very smooth, consistent frame delivery here. Some very minor micro stuttering here and there, but in general, as far as Fortnite goes, really just about as good as you're going to get. All right, now moving over to DirectX 12, and for these tests, I'm actually going to be using TAA at native, just due to the fact that, at 4K resolution, you don't really need a advanced anti-aliasing solution, especially in a game like Fortnite. The amount of pixels that you're getting, just due to the fact that you're at a higher resolution, typically resolve those aliasing issues on their own. So we're here, low settings here, using TAA native at 4K. All right, now here on those low settings, and once again, low settings in a way looks worse, in a way looks better than performance mode, just due to the fact that especially here at 4K, I will say, these low settings, like, look at the wheels on this car, it just looks pretty crazy, which was the case at all of our resolutions, but it's just even more evident here at 4K. But moving over to DirectX 12, even without an FPS cap, does pretty much resolve all of those issues when it comes to our 1% lows. You can see sitting around 190 or so on our FPS average, 1% low, super respectable at around 160, making for a very, very smooth experience. Frame time graph is essentially completely flat. which is a bit of an achievement, especially here on a Unreal Engine title for sure. And really, TAA here looks totally fine, especially at low settings. You know, the model detail is so low that everything is kind of blocky anyway, so there's not really any super fine details that we're having trouble rendering or making out clearly without that nice anti-aliasing. So, in my opinion, TAA doesn't really result in a soft image like it does in some other games. Here at 4K, especially in a game like Fortnite, looks totally fine. Super great experience here. I personally would rather play here, even despite the fact that it looks a little bit more blocky. I would even say in some ways this is a more, performance-like competitive type FPS or a competitive type setting, because at these low settings, everything looks like super, super blocky, which, kind of makes for an ugly picture in a way, but also makes everything look super clear and easy to kind of make out. So in that way, it's a good thing. And you're also, without having to mess with any sort of FPS cap or anything like that, we are getting just kind of by default a real solid experience. Consistent frames, no major dips or drops or anything like that. Super, super solid experience here at low settings. Just, not super great detail, but as far as the card goes and our frame time, Unreal Engine, everything is really humming along really nicely. Only using, less than 5 gigabytes of our video memory. Super, super solid experience here. And next up here, we're going to go for the high preset, which does enable nanite by default. So I am going to go in here and actually turn this off. So this is the high preset, just with no ray tracing quite yet. Dropping in here at high settings, just with that ray tracing off. And we are now getting a real solid, FPS. It's certainly a playable FPS game, looks great. I guess it's kind of teetering on what I would really consider to be like a competitive, experience. We're not in the 120s or 130s, 140s or anything like that. We're just sitting right around 90 to 100. Certainly a really solid experience and definitely feels good here. The other thing to note is even here at high settings, our video memory is not really being used very much at all. We're still well under 8 gigabytes. So the fact that we have 16 has actually not really shown itself to be useful quite yet. I'm sure it will once we bump up settings, and certainly once we turn on the ray tracing. But sitting here on high settings, we definitely like the experience we're getting. Would probably prefer just a bit more, but we do have some upscaling, and just like upscaling looked great at 1440p, it'll look even better at 4K. So let's do just that. We're going to switch back over to TSR Medium and just go for our quality upscaling here. And this does basically right away shoot us into what I would consider to be a competitive-like experience. Right around 140 FPS, definitely really, really solid experience. If you're playing on a TV, many TVs and HDMI cords support that 4K 120 hertz pass through, so you would be able to fully populate that here. And the other thing to note is we are getting these frames at a consistent rate. So it definitely is a real strong looking experience here. So really without much tweaking at all, we're able to shoot right up into a competitive FPS. And as you can see, if we, those same sort of effects that we noticed at our lower resolutions, if we look at our characters' they're still present. If you look closely, there is still a bit of weirdness, but it's not nearly as bad as it was on those lower resolutions. So this upscaling technology definitely works better and looks better on higher resolution. Certainly the case here at 4K. Looks pretty much indistinguishable from native 4K resolution. Don't really see a good reason to not use this upscaling. In my opinion, it looks totally great. I would love it if we had, a different way to get here. If we had FSR4, that would be amazing. We'll be able to get an even better looking picture, especially at lower resolutions. But when you move up to 4K, TSR is certainly more than adequate to give you both a good looking picture and a real solid boost in your FPS. And next setting here we'll go with is Epic. Back on TAA at native resolution here. And the only thing I'm going to adjust for now, though I will test it at our max setting here in a minute, is just turning off our ray tracing. So this is Epic settings once again, just without ray tracing enabled. And as we begin dropping in here with Epic settings, you can see this does look like where our card starts to not be able to achieve 60 FPS. Not a huge surprise. I mean, You know, 9060 XT and the testing that I've done so far seems to be a really, really powerful card and a really solid card. But, you know, asking for native 4K max setting in any game, really, even Fortnite, you know, Fortnite is obviously a competitive title. So maybe you would think, oh, competitive games, you should be able to push them. But obviously, Fortnite has those competitive settings, which we're absolutely blowing through with this card. But when you start enabling, you know, all these sort of ray tracing, max settings, everything like that, it does kind of begin to fall apart a little bit. Although, remember, we are not on that ray tracing preset quite yet. So I will definitely check out what the native performance is with ray tracing. Just out of curiosity, it does look like we are probably right up against where this may be an issue on 8 GB cards. As you can see, we are exceeding 8 GB. Doesn't necessarily mean for sure that it would perform noticeably worse if we only had 8 GB. You know, if you have experience testing these cards against one another, you know that the VRAM allocation doesn't always work exactly how you'd think. So here where we're showing, you know, 8200 megabytes doesn't necessarily mean that if you only had 8 GB, it would necessarily be the bottleneck. It looks like our card has a bottleneck of its own unrelated to the video memory, so that may still be the case even if we only had the 8 GB model. But regardless, we are getting up there, and this is without the ray tracing enabled even, so we certainly are happy that, you know, as we do begin kind of implementing some of these settings that we do have, you know, video memory to spare. We'll be certainly happy about that. But regardless, not really necessarily where you would want to, where you'd really want to be at here. It is worth noting that in indoor areas like this, we are getting pretty high FPS, relatively high. I mean, this is probably where you'd, be happy with the performance, but really as soon as you kind of venture outdoors, more demanding areas, you will start dipping below 60. So not, again, it's okay, but not necessarily where you'd want to be at. However, we are at 4K resolution, so certainly a lot of room here for some upscaling. So let's start just by going over to TSR Medium again, applying our quality upscaling. And at quality upscaling, again, the image looks essentially native, really no issue whatsoever, and this does get us right into that 60 FPS range, actually above 60 FPS. So definitely a real nice experience here. Holding solid right around 90 or so on our average, and looks essentially indistinguishable from native. And same thing, indoor areas like this will give you much higher FPS into the 100s, but not necessarily consistent. As we go outdoors, you can see we dip back down into the 80s. Still, really solid performance. Really no complaints here whatsoever. Now, even though we know we're not going to get 60 FPS because we weren't getting it without ray tracing, just figured I would see what it looks like. So going for completely maxed out settings here at native resolution back on TAA, 100% 3D resolution scale. So this is at native. Lumen Epic for both global illumination and reflections using hardware ray tracing. So completely maxed out settings here at native 4K resolution. Pretty much the most, demanding settings you can possibly ask for in Fortnite. I imagine this will push us well over that 8 GB that we're certainly happy we have more than. But interested to see how exactly the performance is. I don't imagine it's going to be really anywhere near playable. So here at completely maxed out settings, not a huge surprise, but definitely in a state that is pretty much unplayable. Fortnite at sub 60 FPS is not really an experience that you want to have. It looks great. I mean, the reflections all look beautiful around this water, but getting, down into the 20s, obviously, don't need to really tell anyone. I could probably even get it to dip all the way into the teens here if I really, splash around and do enough crazy stuff here, but really not at all where anyone would really want to be playing at. But really what I'm curious here is just how far can we push that TSR to still get, these max settings? Can we get it into a playable state? And this is certainly where I would like to have FSR 4, but again, we don't without the use of Optiscaler, which I don't want to use in an online title. So we're going to go for TSR Medium. Let's just start at quality. I don't imagine this will get us there, but let's see how this improves things. So set to quality, it does give us a pretty nice improvement. 40 FPS, I don't know what it is. The bump from 30 to 40 feels like way better than it should. And, still sub 60 FPS, definitely not where I would personally like to be playing at, but certainly, it's getting there. Now, TSR doesn't really allow for super aggressive upscaling, as we found out before. The lowest we can go is 50% resolution scale. So we're pretty close to 60, but let's see if we can get there with a bit more aggressive. So we're actually going to come down and go straight for that performance 50% resolution scale. And this does actually now get us into a place where we are at 60 plus FPS. And while it does look considerably better than, like, say, even quality upscaling at 1080p, it doesn't look quite as sharp, of course, as some of our other options. You know, when we were using less aggressive upscaling, even quality does look pretty, noticeably better. But hey, if you wanted to play at max settings on Fortnite with ray tracing and all the bells and whistles, can you play at 4K using this GPU? Absolutely. I mean, this is definitely a playable experience. It's consistent. You know, the frame time graph, it's relatively flat. I mean, it's going to have spikes here and there, just part of the game when you're playing on an Unreal Engine 5 game. But, in water, it does actually looks like it still does dip below 60 at times in water, but essentially always above 60 FPS, as long as you maybe stay away from these areas. Now, I wouldn't really recommend these settings. I don't think, once again, I don't really think it's worth it in a game like this to enable the ray tracing, unless you have a GPU that, is good enough that you can kind of just, brute force it with the high settings and still get a competitive type FPS, at least consistently above 60. That's where I'd maybe consider it. But here, using this upscaling, still dipping below 60, I don't really see the point. High settings without the ray tracing, in my opinion, work just fine. We're getting a competitive like FPS. Here to implement this upscaling and get, considerably less FPS doesn't really make a ton of sense in my personal opinion, but, to each their own. And, definitely impressive that a $350 GPU can output, a game as demanding as Fortnite can be, surprisingly, at these high settings at a 60 FPS clip, even without the help of FSR4. Now, I really do hope that Epic at some point does put in the work to properly implement FSR4. I know that they like their own TSR, and it is good. It's especially for a platform and hardware agnostic solution. It does actually perform very well, but FSR4 would be miles better in this particular instance. But the game looks good. It's performing decently enough, not necessarily where I'd want to play at, but holding around 60 FPS on a $350 GPU. Certainly, nothing to really complain about to any major degree. Anyways, guys, that's been Fortnite on our RX 9060 XT 16GB. Definitely, a card that I think for the price, $350, if you can get it at MSRP, and if you like competitive like titles, so long as you're not looking for max 4K settings on these competitive games, which even if you had, a 9070 XT or 5090, 5080, some of those higher end cards, I still wouldn't really recommend playing at these settings. Fortnite is a game that I do play myself on higher end hardware every so often, and I do not go for max ray trace settings at 4K. In my opinion, it's not really worth the performance hit that you're going to be looking at. But 1080p, you can do whatever you want. Pretty much just crank everything with minimal to no upscaling. 1440p, you can also have a ton of fun, play at really high settings, and still get a really solid experience. It's really only once you get to 4K that the card kind of starts showing some of its limitations. But even then, you can still come here, play at max settings. As long as you're okay with some upscaling and, not super high competitive like FPS, you can still have a pretty solid experience. But in general, the 9060 XT 16GB, in my opinion, a sub $400 GPU, this is absolutely the one I would go with, especially considering the 5060 Ti at 16GB is really hard to find at this price point. Anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.